It didn't start with shouting. It didn't start with anger. It started with one woman sitting still at a table, staring straight across the battlefield of Congress. On one side, a wall of voices chanting loyalty, patriotism, real Americans. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, calm as steel, flipping her papers while the storm raged around her. For 60 minutes, the room belonged to them. But in the 61st, it belonged to her. 12 words. That's all it took. Should we talk about Melania's visa history too? The air collapsed. Lawmakers froze like statues. Cameras stuttered. Even Trump's allies blinked as if someone had pulled the rug from under their feet. And then, like fire meeting gasoline, Trump exploded. His fury filled the chamber. But her calm silence cut deeper than any roar. This story you're about to witness is told as it was felt. Dramatic, unflinching, unforgettable. The names are real. The setting is true. But what follows is a dramatized reconstruction. A stage where fact collides with feeling and power collides with truth. The scenes may be reimagined, but the emotions, the injustice, the audacity, the courage are undeniable. So let me ask you, how could one quiet question strip the mask off America's double standards and force even the powerful to tremble? The hearing room at Capitol Hill did not sound like a place of order. It sounded like a battlefield. Microphones cracked like gunfire. Voices overlapped in waves of accusation, and camera shutters snapped with the nervous rhythm of a drumline. Reporters leaned forward in their chairs, pens scratching furiously across notepads as if the next word might be the spark that set the entire chamber ablaze. Papers rustled like restless wings. The air smelled of sweat and stale coffee, heavy with the fatigue of too many hours of theater dressed up as governance. On the front row, aides whispered frantically into each other's ears, their ties crooked, their brows damp. The people's house felt less like democracy and more like a circus ring, each lawmaker fighting for a louder roar than the last. One Republican voice thundered above the rest, pounding the word loyalty like a gavel. Another hurled the phrase real Americans as though it were a shield against doubt. The words were not arguments, they were weapons, polished for television and hurled across the room with precision. You could almost see the sound bouncing off the marble walls, ricocheting from microphone to microphone. And yet, through it all, there she was, Jasmine Crockett. She sat at the long wooden desk, posture straight, her fingers grazing the edges of her papers as if she were simply reviewing notes. Her eyes, though, told a different story. They scanned the room like a chess player studying the board, unbothered by the chaos, waiting for the precise moment when a single move could flip the game. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look up often. But every time she did, every time her gaze lifted from the page, the temperature in the room seemed to shift. A quiet tension followed her eyes, like a ripple spreading through water after a stone has been dropped. Camera operators noticed. They zoomed in, drawn not to the shouting congressman, but to the woman who wasn't speaking. In politics, silence can be more dangerous than noise. Jasmine knew that, and the room, whether it realized it or not, was beginning to sense it too. The circus continued. Shouts about American values, accusations about who belongs and who doesn't. It was the kind of spectacle the nation had seen 100 times before. But what no one realized was that the most important moment of the day wasn't in the shouting. It was in the waiting. Because power doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with patience. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, disguised as composure. And in that overheated chamber, while men rattled the air with slogans and cameras fed the frenzy, Jasmine Crockett was loading a question so sharp, so precise, it would cut through all the noise with a single strike. The loudest voice in the room wasn't the one that shouted the most. It was the one that hadn't spoken yet. The shouting hadn't slowed. A congressman from Florida leaned forward, jabbing his finger in the air as though each gesture could nail down his argument. Loyalty, he thundered. Patriotism, Foundational values. His words bounced hard against the marble walls, swollen with righteousness. Reporters scribbled, cameras zoomed in, and the entire scene seemed destined to collapse under its own noise. And then, from the other side of the table, Jasmine Crockett spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even clear her throat. Her tone was even, measured, almost casual, as though she were asking the time of day. Yet it landed like a stone through glass. If you want to question my loyalty, should we also talk about Melania's visa history? The effect was immediate, not figurative. Literal. The room froze. Pens stopped mid-scratch. Reporters lifted their heads, eyes wide, as though they'd misheard. Aides leaned back in their chairs. One Republican's mouth hung open just long enough for the cameras to capture his stunned expression. Even some Democrats shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to applaud or hold their breath. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the pause after lightning but before thunder. For weeks, they had hurled coded insults about her background, her right to belong, her Americanness. They had wrapped suspicion in patriotic language, packaging bias as civic duty. And Jasmine, with one sentence, had turned the blade back toward them. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't insulted. She had asked a question, a simple question, and that, perhaps, was what made it so lethal. Because questions, unlike accusations, demand an answer. On the Republican side of the dais, faces tightened. The congressman who had just delivered his sermon on Real Americans blinked rapidly, his lips twitching for a response that refused to come. On the Democratic side, a staffer dropped his pen, the sound far louder in the silence than it should have been. In the press box, a journalist mouthed the words slowly, almost reverently, like a prayer. Melania's visa history. It didn't sound like a personal jab. It sounded like a mirror held up to the entire room, reflecting every double standard they had carefully ignored. For years, immigrant families with brown skin, with accents, with unfamiliar last names had been interrogated, doubted, torn apart over the smallest paperwork error. Meanwhile, Melania Trump's own immigration path, full of unanswered questions and suspicious gaps, had floated above scrutiny, protected by beauty, whiteness, and marriage to power, and now in front of the cameras. Jasmine had asked the question no one else dared. Why the two sets of rules? It wasn't rage that unsettled the room. It wasn't even the content of her words. It was the calm precision, the refusal to flinch, the deadly composure of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. The circus had been silenced, and for the first time that day, the audience leaned forward, not to catch the loudest voice, but to hear what the quiet one would say next. The silence inside the hearing chamber didn't last long. 10 seconds after Jasmine Crockett's words, 10 seconds of stunned stillness. The world outside began to move. A congressional aide clipped the moment, trimmed it into a neat bite-sized video, and before the gavel had even dropped, the clip was already in the bloodstream of social media. 10 seconds. That was all it took. Phones lit up in coffee shops, airports, and kitchens. The clip spread like sparks in dry grass, carried by retweets, stitched on TikTok, replayed in grainy edits on Instagram. Within the hour, Jasmine said it was trending in 3 states. By evening, it was climbing the national list. Supporters turned the line into a rallying cry. Memes popped up with Jasmine's face framed by bold letters. Should we talk about Melania's visa history too? College students shared the video with captions like, "She asked what we've all been thinking." Civil rights advocates called it the question heard across America. But the pushback came just as fast. Conservative outlets seized the moment, twisting the narrative like taffy. A radio host thundered into the mic. Did Crockett just call for deporting a former First Lady? A cable news chyron blared, Democrat attacks Melania's immigration status. By nightfall, Protect Melania was trending alongside Sir Jasmine said it. The digital battlefield split in two. On Facebook, furious comments piled up. She hates America. Ungrateful radical. Attack on women. Clips were cut down, context stripped away, until Jasmine's calm question was warped into something it never was. And yet, something unexpected began to happen. While headlines screamed and hashtags clashed, everyday viewers went searching for the original. They wanted the uncut version, the truth without filters. By midnight, Jasmine's official channel had uploaded the full footage of the hearing, 2 hours long, unedited, and people watched, not just the viral 10 seconds, but the pauses, the exchanges, the tone of her voice. Comments flooded in beneath the video. She never said deport. Oh, funny how they can dish it, but can't take it. Why does asking a question terrify them this much? The clip didn't just spread, it taught viewers to compare, to question the story being sold to them. By morning, over 800,000 people had seen the full exchange. Some watched twice, rewinding to the moment the room froze, dissecting every flicker of expression. For the first time in years, a political theater wasn't just noise, it was a mirror. People weren't asking, "Did she say it?" anymore. They were asking, "Why are they so afraid of the question?" The online circus had begun, hashtags battling like armies, pundits spinning their tales. But beneath the roar, beneath the distortions and defenses, another current was building, quieter, steadier, more dangerous to the status quo. It was the current of ordinary people deciding to see for themselves. The headlines belonged to her critics, but the truth, now in the hands of millions of viewers, belonged to Jasmine. By the time dawn broke over Washington, the clip had become unavoidable. From airport lounges to breakfast diners, screens replayed the same 10 seconds on loop. Jasmine Crockett asking the question no one dared, and the chamber falling into stunned silence. For most politicians, the backlash alone might have been enough to send them scrambling for cover. But this was not a story about silence. It was a story about volume, and no one understood that better than Donald J. Trump. At exactly 9:42 p.m., his digital trumpet sounded. On Truth Social, a post erupted in screaming capital letters. Disgusting attack on Melania. Jasmine Crockett should apologize to the former First Lady immediately. The words came like cannon fire, loud, blunt, designed for impact rather than precision. Within minutes, replies poured in. Loyalists echoed his outrage. She hates America. Another radical left attack. Lock her up. The volume of anger climbed higher with every repost, every meme, every insult hurled into the echo chamber. And Trump wasn't done. At 10:13, another post. These people hate success. They hate beauty. They hate America. Melania came here legally. Crockett is a nobody looking for ratings. The phrasing was familiar, the cadence almost rehearsed. Anger was his instrument, and he played it loudly. But behind the capital letters and exclamation marks, one detail stood out. He never addressed the substance of Jasmine's question. He didn't explain, didn't clarify, didn't defend the timeline that had long raised quiet doubts. He simply shouted louder, hoping the noise would drown the silence she had carved into the hearing. Cable news wasted no time turning the clash into spectacle. On one network, a split screen showed Trump's post side by side with Jasmine's clip. Anchors leaned in with furrowed brows, demanding to know whether the Congresswoman had gone too far. On another, pundit sat in a glossy studio, voices raised, each competing for the sharpest attack line. "This is a coordinated assault on the First Lady," one barked. "This is what happens when the radical left hates family values." Another sneered. But in between the shouting, a strange contrast began to emerge. Jasmine Crockett's face, pulled from the hearing footage, appeared calm, steady, eyes unwavering as she asked her question. Next to her image, Trump's words blazed across the screen in furious caps. The juxtaposition was unavoidable. one composed, one combustible. For viewers flipping channels, the emotional beat was clear. Anger is loud, but composure is unforgettable. Trump's fury may have dominated the headlines, but Jasmine's calm cut deeper into memory. And here lay the twist. For all his posts, for all the noise, Trump never once defended Melania's immigration record. He didn't answer the question. He couldn't. Instead, he leaned on rage, betting that volume could replace truth. Yet the more he screamed, the more people noticed what he wasn't saying. The fury was unleashed. Yes, but it only amplified the calm that had triggered it. By sunrise, the story had mutated into something larger, louder, and almost unrecognizable. What had begun as one calm question inside the marble walls of Congress was now a firestorm flashing across every screen in America. On talk radio, voices crackled with fury. "This is what the radical left does," one host barked, pounding his desk for effect. "They attack family. They attack women. They attack America." Another host snarled through a cigarette-stained growl. "What's next? Deporting first ladies? Where does it end?" Each soundbite was shorter, sharper, designed to pierce through morning traffic and lodge itself in the minds of commuters. Television wasn't any calmer. Across networks, bold red chyrons screamed words like "Visa shocker," "Crockett attacks Melania," "Loyalty on trial." Clips of Jasmine's 10-second remark looped endlessly, chopped down to half phrases and replayed over swelling background music. Studio screens flashed with sensational graphics, split images of Melania smiling in a designer gown against Jasmine, frozen mid-sentence, her mouth slightly open, as if captured in the act of defiance. In living rooms and waiting rooms, the circus was relentless. Panels of pundits leaned forward in choreographed outrage, their voices rising and overlapping until no one could be heard. One commentator declared Crockett a disgrace to Congress. Another warned of dangerous precedent, and as the camera panned across the set, you could almost hear the producers whispering in their earpieces, louder, sharper, angrier. Inside Jasmine's office, the atmosphere was no less tense. Staffers clustered around glowing screens, scrolling through headlines with furrowed brows. "This is spiraling," one aide muttered, her voice tight. "We need a response." Another shook his head. "No, if we hit back, we just feed the machine. They want us in the mud." Lane Robbins, Jasmine's chief of staff, paced the length of the office, phone in hand, glancing every few seconds at the notifications lighting up his screen. "They're painting you as anti-immigrant," he said, looking at Jasmine. "It's absurd, but absurd doesn't matter when it's on repeat." He paused, exhaled. "Do we stay quiet, or do we fight?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She sat at her desk, the noise of the media circus echoing faintly through the flat screen on the wall. For a moment, she looked almost detached, eyes lowered to the papers in front of her. Then she set them down gently and leaned back in her chair. "We don't fight," she said evenly. "We show." That afternoon, her official account uploaded the full, uncut hearing footage. Not a 10-second clip, not an edited highlight. The entire 2 hours, untouched. No dramatic music, no commentary, no captions, just the raw exchange, with every question and every answer intact. At first, it seemed too quiet a move, drowned by the roaring machine of outrage. But by nightfall, something shifted. The video began climbing, shared not by pundits, but by ordinary viewers. Comments appeared like small sparks. "She never said deport." "Watch the full thing. Completely different story." Funny how the loudest voices cut the most out. In a world addicted to noise, Jasmine had chosen silence, and silence revealed the truth. The circus screamed louder than ever, but the sharpest weapon turned out not to be volume. It was clarity. By the third day, the debate no longer belonged to Washington. It had spilled far beyond the marble halls and flashing cameras, drifting into the rhythms of ordinary America. In a diner off Route 66, truckers leaned over chipped coffee mugs, arguing across a sticky counter. "She went too far," one said, stabbing at his eggs with a fork. "Questioning a first lady? That's un-American." From the next booth, a waitress paused in mid-pour and muttered just loud enough, "She's not wrong, though. Rules ain't the same for everyone." The clash of opinions mixed with the hiss of the griddle, as common and combustible as the smell of bacon grease. At a senior center in Ohio, the television in the lounge flickered with cable news reruns. A group of retirees sat in folding chairs, half listening between rounds of bingo. One woman shook her head, adjusting her glasses. "I don't like the way she said it. Too sharp." Beside her, a Korean War veteran tapped his cane against the floor. "I serve this country," he said quietly. "And I still get asked where I'm from. That congresswoman just said what's true." The room fell into thoughtful silence, broken only by the voice of the announcer calling numbers. Barber shops carried the conversation too. In Philadelphia, men leaned back in chairs, capes draped across their shoulders, watching the viral clip replay on a phone propped against the mirror. "They're calling her anti-American?" the barber asked, scissors snipping in rhythm. "Man, she's just asking why the rules ain't the same." Heads nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the shop. Someone in the back added, "Yeah, but she said it in front of the whole world. That's different." The shop grew quiet for a beat. Different. Yes. Necessary. Maybe more. Across small towns and city corners, the argument cut through political labels. It wasn't just Democrat versus Republican. It was about who had felt the sting of suspicion and who had never known it. For some, Jasmine Crockett's words landed like an insult. For others, they felt like long-delayed vindication. And then came Arizona. Outside a federal courthouse in Mesa, what was supposed to be a modest rally for immigration reform grew larger by the hour. Teachers, nurses, veterans, students, more than 500 people, gathered with handmade signs. One stood out from the rest. A young woman named Ana Ruiz, born in Flagstaff to Mexican parents, held a piece of cardboard scrawled with 7 words. "If Melania gets to stay, so should my dad." The sign was blunt, almost childlike in its simplicity, but it pierced through the noise more cleanly than any cable panel or pundit monologue. Cameras captured it, and by evening it was plastered across evening news segments and social media feeds. What had begun as a single question in Congress was no longer about Melania, no longer about Crockett, no longer even about Trump. It was about fairness, about the uneven scales every immigrant family knew too well. The divide was real. Some bristled, some applauded. But in that moment on the courthouse steps, the issue was reframed in words no headline could spin. If the rules don't apply equally, then they aren't rules at all. Long before she walked into Capitol Hill, long before cameras chased her every word, Jasmine Crockett was fighting in courtrooms no one bothered to film. Dallas, Texas, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the hum of an old air conditioner, and rows of young Black and Latino men shuffling in with shackles clinking at their ankles. It wasn't the grandeur of Congress. It was the grind of a public defender's office, where the stakes were smaller on paper, but enormous for the lives in front of her. Case after case landed on her desk. A teenager stopped for a busted taillight who ended up charged with resisting arrest. A mother accused of shoplifting diapers while her paychecks were still processing. A young man ticketed 3 times in 1 month because his accent marked him as foreign, even though he'd been born in Texas. The pattern was cruel and consistent, every mistake magnified, every explanation dismissed. Jasmine learned quickly that justice wasn't blind, it was selective. And every time she stood before a judge, she carried that weight. She remembered one case with perfect clarity. A 19-year-old Black kid arrested for a small bag of marijuana found during a traffic stop that never should have happened. No record, no violence, nothing but bad luck and skin color. The prosecution pushed for jail time. Jasmine stood up, voice steady but burning. "You're building cages around this boy's future for something you'd excuse in your nephew," she told the court. The room stiffened. The judge blinked, taken aback not by the evidence, but by the truth laid bare. She didn't win full freedom, but she won something. Probation instead of prison, a second chance instead of a permanent scar. Moments like that carved themselves into her memory. Each client's face, each family's tears, each silent nod of gratitude. They sharpened her words and taught her that calm precision cut deeper than shouting. Because when the system was stacked against you, raising your voice too high only gave them another excuse not to listen. So she trained herself to speak in a way that made silence impossible. Direct, unflinching, surgical. In those Dallas courtrooms, she practiced the art that would later freeze Congress, taking the question they feared most and dropping it at their feet like a weight they couldn't lift. That's why, when she sat in that congressional chamber years later, she didn't fumble into controversy or lose her temper. Her question about Melania's visa history wasn't a slip. It was muscle memory. It was the same fire that once stood up for a 19-year-old against a system that wanted him buried under paperwork and prejudice. Jasmine Crockett wasn't reckless. She was rehearsed. Every courtroom in Dallas had been her training ground. And when she finally walked into Congress, she wasn't just carrying notes. She was carrying years of battles where the quietest voice had been forced to scream through its silence. While Jasmine Crockett had spent years defending clients whose lives were upended by minor mistakes, Melania Trump's own journey through America's immigration system had always been wrapped in silence. There were questions, yes, whispers in newspapers, investigative reports that surfaced every few years, but they never seemed to stick. They faded like smoke the moment they appeared. Journalists had pointed out the gaps before. Dates that didn't align between her modeling jobs and the paperwork she filed. A work visa that may not have authorized some of the photo shoots she took early in her career. Headlines hinted at inconsistencies, but the coverage never turned into outrage. The story slipped beneath the surface every time, drowned out by glossy magazine covers and the aura of a European accent delivered with elegance. For most of America, the unspoken verdict was simple. She married right. She looked right, and that was enough. While Black and brown families were grilled for a missing signature or a misplaced date, Melania's irregularities were brushed aside as paperwork quirks. Immigration lawyers quietly noted that the path she described in interviews didn't match the timelines on record, but those details lived in the margins, never in the headlines. And why would they? She had been elevated as a symbol, a model turned first lady, statuesque, polished, untouchable. No one wanted to peer too closely at the paperwork behind the photographs. The public shrugged, deciding the rules didn't need to be applied equally when the face fit the part. But Jasmine's question pulled the curtain back in a way no journalist's article ever had. By asking it in Congress, under oath, on camera, she transformed those old whispers into a demand. For the first time, America had to look at the contrast side by side. A 19-year-old Black kid nearly caged for a bag of marijuana versus a Slovenian model whose unclear paperwork had never been scrutinized with the same intensity. Suddenly, the what-ifs became unavoidable. What if Melania hadn't married into money and power? What if her skin had been darker, her accent heavier, her last name less European? Would she have been celebrated? Or would she have been detained in an airport back room? Her future decided by the mood of a single officer. The country's conscience was pricked. Not because Jasmine invented a scandal, but because she reminded everyone of the double standard they had long chosen not to see. In living rooms across America, viewers who had once shrugged now leaned back and whispered to themselves, "If it were my daughter, would the rules have bent so easily?" That was the real twist. Melania's immigration history had always been there, like an unopened file, but it took a Black congresswoman's calm question to force the nation to finally ask the only question that mattered. Why do the rules only seem to apply to some? By the end of the week, the viral clip had transformed into something larger than politics. Social media wasn't just replaying Jasmine's words anymore. It was filling up with new ones. A young woman in Houston posted a photo of her mother's immigration file, thick with stamps and sticky notes. The caption simple: one typo almost cost her everything. I am Jasmine. And in California, a college student filmed himself in his dorm room, speaking quietly into the camera. My dad was detained for 6 months because his paperwork renewal got delayed in the system. 6 months. Meanwhile, we pretend others just stumble through the process. I am Jasmine. The stories kept coming. Men, women, families, teenagers. Some shared grainy photos of relatives who'd been deported over clerical errors. Others wrote threads describing endless interviews, background checks, and the constant fear that a misplaced form could erase decades of work. Each post ended the same way, with Jasmine's question echoing back to them. Why the double standard? The hashtag grew like wildfire. One I am Jasmine. At first, a handful of posts, then hundreds. By the weekend, tens of thousands. It wasn't just immigrants who joined in. Veterans shared how they had fought for the country, only to be asked if they belonged. Itinerant nurses, teachers, even second-generation Americans with perfect English and birth certificates wrote about being told to prove it. Jasmine's calm defiance had cracked open a door that millions rushed through. What made the moment powerful wasn't rage or insults. It was the eerie calm that threaded through every story. Just like Jasmine's delivery in Congress. These weren't shouts. They were truths spoken plainly, with the weight of lived experience behind them. People weren't screaming at America. They were holding up a mirror, inside her office. Jasmine scrolled through the posts late one night, her desk lit only by the glow of her phone. She read about a mother who lost her chance at residency because a single form was filed in the wrong month. She read about a young man who missed his grandmother's funeral because his re-entry visa was delayed. She read about children living in fear of knock-on-the-door raids, their lives shaped by a bureaucracy that treated them as suspects first and humans second. Her staff watched her carefully. Lane, her chief of staff, finally spoke. This isn't just about Melania anymore. Jasmine nodded slowly, eyes still on the screen. She felt it too. The shift. Her question had begun as a counterpunch to hypocrisy, but now it had become something larger, something heavier. It was no longer her battle alone. It was a national mirror, reflecting millions of faces that had waited too long for someone to ask out loud what they had whispered in private. And that realization hit harder than any headline or trending hashtag. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just speaking for herself. She had become the voice of a truth too many people already knew, a truth America could no longer ignore. The flood of support online had been overwhelming, but it came with a shadow that grew darker each day. Alongside the thank you notes and stories of solidarity, Jasmine's office inbox began filling with another kind of message. Emails laced with racial slurs, voicemails growled with threats, letters stuffed into envelopes scrawled in red ink. Go back where you came from. At first, the staff tried to screen them quietly. They deleted what they could, archived what they couldn't, but the volume multiplied. Some messages dripped with pure venom, sentences written in capital letters that felt like shouted curses on paper. One envelope arrived with no return address, no note, just a single bullet casing taped inside. Lane, her chief of staff, set it on his desk for a long moment, staring at it as though it might still be hot from the barrel. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room felt the chill. The FBI was called in, discreet and measured. 2 agents visited the office, suits sharp, voices calm, jotting notes as they photographed the casing and logged the mail. They didn't promise miracles. They rarely do in cases like this, but they assured Jasmine's team they would keep eyes on the situation. For her staff, young, dedicated, but visibly shaken, that was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting that someone was watching, terrifying that someone needed to. Jasmine remained outwardly calm, though the toll pressed at the edges. Staffers caught her pausing by the window longer than usual, staring at the Capitol dome glowing in the night. Sometimes she would close her office door just to breathe, to gather herself before stepping back into the storm. The threats weren't just words. They were meant to make her shrink, to make her hesitate. And then, one evening after another long day, her phone buzzed with a call from home. It was her mother. Jasmine answered, her voice catching slightly as she said, "Hey, Mama." Her mother's tone was steady, warm but firm, as though she had been waiting for this moment. "Baby, I know it's loud right now. Louder than it's ever been. But remember what I told you when you first ran for office. They don't get to define you. Not ever. Not even when it's ugly. Not even when it's loud." The words slid into Jasmine's chest like an anchor, grounding her. She closed her eyes and let the silence stretch between them, the kind of silence that steadies rather than shakes. When she hung up, something had shifted. The threats were still there, the fear still real, but they no longer had the power to dictate her next step. Instead of shrinking her, the hatred hardened her resolve. The more they tried to intimidate her, the more determined she became to stand taller, speak clearer, and refuse to be erased. The dark side of fame had revealed itself, but instead of drowning her, it sharpened her edge. It was late afternoon when Jasmine's staff buzzed her office to announce a visitor. The name on the slip made her pause. Eli Kwan. She hadn't seen him in years. Back in Dallas, he had been one of the few immigration lawyers who shared her endless nights at community legal clinics, combing through endless stacks of paperwork for families who couldn't afford representation. Together, they defended people living in the shadows, people one signature away from being torn apart. Now, he stood at her office door in Washington, his shoulders slumped, his eyes lined with fatigue. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days. In his hands was a plain, manila folder, edges frayed, as if it had been carried back and forth too many times before he finally decided where it belonged. "Are we secure?" he asked quietly as Lane, Jasmine's chief of staff, ushered him inside. His voice carried both urgency and unease, like a man who had wrestled with a choice for too long. Jasmine gestured for him to sit. "Eli," she said softly, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "It's been a long time." He didn't return the smile. He set the folder down on her desk, sliding it forward with both hands. "This isn't public yet, but it will be. And when it is, you need to be ready." Jasmine opened the folder. Inside were scanned documents, some yellowed with age, others stamped with official seals. Her eyes scanned the first few pages quickly, then slowed. Visa applications, correspondence, requests for reconsideration, and then the details that made her eyebrows lift. Dates that didn't line up, signatures that contradicted earlier filings, notes about freelance modeling work done before official authorization had been approved. She read one letter twice, then a third time, as if confirming that the words on the page wouldn't rearrange themselves into something less damning. "You verified this?" she asked finally, her voice even. Eli nodded. Quietly, 3 times over. "I've been sitting on it for weeks. Jasmine, but after what you said, after how they've twisted your words, I realize silence is complicity. You didn't lie. You asked the question everyone else was too afraid to, and this," he tapped the folder with his finger, "this is proof the question matters." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of traffic outside. Lane stood stiffly by the window, his eyes fixed on the folder as if it were a live grenade. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting lightly on the papers. Her face betrayed no triumph, no glee, only the solemn recognition of what lay before her. This was no longer about whispers or rumors, no longer about clever pundit spins or partisan outrage. For the first time, the possibility of documented fact entered the picture. If the narrative turned now, it wouldn't be because of a soundbite. It would be because the paper trail finally spoke. Jasmine closed the folder gently, her hands steady. "All right," she said, her voice low but certain. "Let's get ready." The fight had just shifted. The folder from Eli Kwan was still sitting on Jasmine's desk when the news cycle jolted again. It came not from a leaked memo or a courtroom filing, but from a quiet corner of the internet, a podcast called The Politic Room. Its episodes usually drew a modest audience of policy wonks and political junkies. But that week, it carried a voice no one had heard in years. Sonia Lavelle. Sonia had once been Melania Trump's aide, a woman whose job was to manage schedules, coordinate travel, and keep the First Lady's calendar spotless. She was never the face of the administration, rarely quoted, rarely photographed, but she had been there. She had seen everything. And when the podcast host asked why she had finally chosen to speak, Sonia's answer was soft but sharp. "I never thought I'd be doing this," she began, her voice steady despite a faint tremor of nerves. "But watching what's happening to Congresswoman Crockett this week, it made me realize silence is complicity. And I can't stay silent anymore." The host leaned in, almost holding his breath. "Are you saying there were questions about the visa timeline?" Sonia exhaled slowly, as if releasing a weight she had carried for 2 decades. "We all knew the timeline didn't add up. I remember back in 2001, Melania got nervous after a magazine asked about her modeling days before her paperwork was finalized. She told me once, 'I don't want people going through my papers.' And I thought at the time, why would they? But the truth is, the dates never matched." Those words, "we all knew the timeline didn't add up," ricocheted through the political world like a struck bell. Headlines ignited within the hour. Former aide confirms visa inconsistencies. Insider speaks, Melania new timeline flawed. Unlike speculation from journalists or partisan critics, Sonia's testimony carried the weight of proximity. She had been inside the walls, behind the curtain, and now she was pulling the fabric back for everyone to see. Cable anchors replayed the soundbite on loop, her calm delivery contrasting with the shock waves it caused. Newspaper websites plastered her quotes across their homepages. Even outlets that had once dismissed the story as gossip were forced to acknowledge it now. The question that Jasmine had first raised, once caricatured as an attack, was suddenly transformed into a matter of credibility and inquiry. Meanwhile, Jasmine herself stayed unusually quiet. Her office released no triumphant statements, no fiery posts. When a reporter shouted a question at her in the hallway, she simply smiled politely and kept walking. She didn't need to add to the noise. Others were carrying the truth now, and she understood the power of stepping aside to let the facts speak. The twist was undeniable. What had begun as a single sentence in a crowded hearing, a moment critics tried to dismiss as reckless or personal, had evolved into something far larger. It was no longer about Crockett versus Trump. It was no longer about one congresswoman's nerve. It was about the integrity of the system itself. And for the first time, whispers of a national investigation began to circulate. The frenzy of headlines and pundit panels was still roaring when the story took an unexpected turn. It didn't come from Washington. It didn't come from cable news. It came from a simple classroom in El Paso, Texas. Ms. Herrera, a middle school history teacher, sat at her desk one afternoon after the final bell had rung. She opened her phone, hit record, and spoke with the tired honesty of someone who had run out of patience. "My students ask me every week," she said softly, "why their parents have to carry papers everywhere they go. Green cards, work permits, residency proofs. They ask, 'Miss, what happens if Mama forgets her folder?' They're scared all the time." She paused, her eyes wet, before adding the line that cut through the noise. "And then they see Melania didn't have to, and they ask me, why?" She didn't shout. She didn't perform. She just told the truth into a cracked phone screen. Within 24 hours, and honey, her clip had been shared tens of thousands of times. Teachers in other cities stitched their own videos, sharing stories of children panicking when their fathers were pulled over, or crying when immigration officials knocked on their door at dawn. A quiet chorus was forming, one that no cable chyron could twist. And then came the veteran. In a suburb of Atlanta, Robert Gaines, a 62-year-old retired Army sergeant, set up his phone in the backyard he had mowed that morning. He wore a faded baseball cap and leaned against the wooden fence he had built himself. His voice carried the slow cadence of someone who had lived through too much to waste words. "I served this country twice overseas," he began, eyes narrowed against the sun. "I wore the uniform. I lost friends. And still, when I walk into a store, people ask me where I'm from. I tell them, Alabama. But that's never enough." He lifted a folded flag from a box on the patio, holding it like something both sacred and unbearably heavy. "They ask for my story, for my proof, for my papers. But Melania?" He let the silence hang for a long moment. "She never had to answer those questions." The clip spread like wildfire. Veterans groups reposted it. Military families commented beneath it. "My husband served, too. We know this pain." Uniform doesn't erase the question when your skin is brown. Gaines's video crossed political lines, resonating with conservatives and progressives alike. Because it wasn't about party, it was about fairness. By the end of the week, the hashtags weren't just about Jasmine Crockett anymore. They were filled with teachers' stories, veterans' testimonies, parents' quiet confessions. Pundits shouted over each other on television, but their words suddenly seemed small, distant, almost irrelevant. The voices that mattered most were no longer in the studio. They were in classrooms, in backyards, in the homes of ordinary Americans who had carried invisible burdens for too long. The twist was clear. For the first time, the people's voices were eclipsing the pundits. And once they began to speak, it was impossible to push them back into silence. The story that began with a single question in Congress was no longer confined to Washington. It had drifted into classrooms, cafeterias, and campus quads. Across the country, young people were picking it up, not as a weapon, but as a puzzle that demanded answers. At a university in Chicago, dozens of students sat cross-legged inside the student union. They weren't chanting or waving megaphones. Their protest was quiet, almost scholarly. Cardboard signs rested in their laps with handwritten questions. Who gets to belong? Would she be here if her name was Maria? Why does paperwork matter for some and not others? The sit-in wasn't angry. It was insistent, steady, a reminder that silence can be just as loud when it refuses to move. News crews arrived expecting fiery speeches and found something more unsettling. Thoughtful stillness. One reporter admitted on air. It's harder to dismiss them when they're not shouting, just asking. The image of young Americans sitting with questions, not slogans, began circulating widely online. It became a contrast to the noise of the political class, a generational rebuke that clarity doesn't always come in capital letters. High schools began to follow. In a civics classroom in Phoenix, a teacher decided to seize the moment. She wrote in bold chalk on the board, "The Crockett question." Beneath it, she added, "Should the law treat everyone the same?" Hands shot up. One student argued that immigration law must be enforced strictly or it loses meaning. Another countered, "But if we bend rules for the powerful, isn't that worse?" The room buzzed with energy, not hostility. Students were thinking aloud, debating policy not as an abstract idea but as something that touched their neighbors, their families, maybe even their own lives. For many of them, it was the first time politics had felt less like a distant performance and more like a mirror. Clips of these classroom debates began appearing on TikTok and Instagram. Teenagers filmed themselves saying, "Today we debated Crockett's question. I don't agree with her, but it made me think." Another confessed, "I never thought about what my mom went through until I saw this." The honesty, the vulnerability resonated. Unlike politicians, these students weren't rehearsed. They were discovering the issue in real time, and their curiosity spread faster than outrage ever could. College debate clubs, high school assemblies, even middle school essays began echoing the same theme. Who truly belongs in America, and who gets to decide? A generational dialogue had cracked open, and it wasn't closing anytime soon. The twist became undeniable. What had been intended as a silencing moment for Jasmine Crockett, a dismissive laugh at her question, an attempt to put her back in her place, had instead become the ignition point for a new conversation, not just among politicians or pundits, but among the very generation who would inherit the answers. And once young people began asking out loud, the country had no choice but to listen. On a gray Saturday morning in Pittsburgh, the hum of clippers filled a barber shop tucked between a laundromat and a corner deli. The walls were lined with faded sports posters, but the real action was always in the chairs. Men came not only for trims but for talk, the kind of talk that spilled deeper than politics, reaching the marrow of lived experience. "She didn't say anything new," one barber remarked as he adjusted the cape around a customer. His voice carried over the buzzing machines. "She just said it where they couldn't ignore it." The conversation turned, as it often did, to fairness. "I've been saying this for years," another man jumped in, leaning forward in his chair. "If my cousin had half the mistakes she had on her papers, he'd have been deported before he even unpacked his bags." The room hummed with agreement, the rhythm of nodding heads syncing with the snip of scissors. In one corner, a retired steelworker rubbed his hands together slowly. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice gravelly, scarred by decades of labor. "And I still got asked where I was really from." You think she ever had to answer that? The barber shop went silent for a beat, the weight of his words heavier than the clippers in their hands. The emotional shift was clear. These were men who had complained, argued, and vented about inequality countless times within these walls. But Jasmine's calm delivery, her unshaken tone in the face of dismissal, had carried those same barbershop truths into the halls of power. Older men admitted something that caught even them by surprise. "She made us sound like we belonged in the room, too." One younger customer, no more than 25, pulled out his phone and replayed the clip of Jasmine on the house floor. He set it on the counter like a record everyone needed to hear. "Listen to that. She ain't raising her voice. She ain't backing down. That's exactly how we talk here." Heads leaned closer to the tiny screen, watching again, as though the truth felt fresher each time. The realization settled in with an unexpected twist. The movement wasn't being pushed forward by politicians or pundits. It wasn't fueled by hashtags alone. It was being carried on the breath of ordinary people in spaces like this: barbershops, diners, back porches. Every retelling of Jasmine's words became an act of ownership, as if her voice had unlocked something that had always belonged to them, but had never been recognized beyond their walls. By the time the morning rush wound down, the barbershop had turned into more than a place for fades and tapers. It was a pulpit, a forum, a living archive of testimony. Men walked out not just with sharp lines, but with the sense that they had been witnesses to something larger, a moment where the conversations they had been having for decades were finally being heard by the nation. And in that simple exchange, repeated chair by chair, a quiet revolution was taking shape. One haircut at a time, the first article dropped on a quiet Wednesday morning. At first, it seemed like just another speculative piece, until readers noticed the attachments. Scanned images of visa forms, stamped dates that didn't match, a modeling contract signed months before the authorization that was supposed to allow it. These weren't rumors anymore. They were documents. Within hours, other outlets pounced. Major newspapers sent their investigative desks into overdrive. Fact-checkers combed through the files, line by line, comparing them against official records. By midday, the verdict was clear. Discrepancies weren't just whispers. They were real, and they were staring the nation in the face. Cable news screens filled with graphics, side-by-side timelines, arrows pointing to the gaps. Talk show hosts who had once dismissed the issue now hesitated. A CNN anchor summarized it bluntly: "If this paperwork belonged to anyone else, they'd be in removal proceedings right now." The Trump team scrambled. Their first statement was terse, almost mechanical. This is politically motivated. Hours later, a spokesperson added, the documents are being taken out of context. But the problem was, the context wasn't going away. The papers were now public property, downloaded, screenshotted, and circulated faster than any denial could catch up. In suburban living rooms, moderates who had shrugged off the early debate now leaned forward in disbelief. A retired accountant in Ohio told his daughter, I've filed thousands of forms. You don't get these dates wrong accidentally. At kitchen tables across the country, people who had once said, why stir this up, began to recognize the unmistakable outline of a double standard. The emotional weight wasn't in the headlines alone. It was in the quiet reckonings happening behind closed doors. A Latina nurse in Arizona replayed Jasmine's moment in Congress, whispering to her husband, so it wasn't just about her. It's about all of us who've ever been told the rules only apply one way. Online, the hashtag #SciAmJasmine surged again, this time paired with screenshots of the leaked files. Each post carried its own sting. Stories of families torn apart over paperwork mistakes. Young professionals deported for missing a single deadline. Against those testimonies, the documents felt like more than a bureaucratic oversight. They felt like proof of privilege laid bare. For Jasmine, the shift was almost surreal. She didn't have to shout. She didn't have to explain. Others were now connecting the dots she had pointed toward. Every anchor, every podcast host, every neighbor passing along the story carried her original calm defiance into new corners of the country. The twist was undeniable. The smoke wasn't just smoke anymore. The documents had given it weight, density, permanence. Americans who had long preferred to look away now found themselves staring directly at the fire's glow. And in that glow, the nation's question had transformed. No longer, was she right to ask? But why wasn't this asked long before? At first, the change was almost imperceptible, a shift in tone, a pause where once there had been laughter. On talk radio, the hosts who had spent weeks sneering at Jasmine's question began to tread lightly. One of them, a conservative firebrand known for dismissing anything tied to her name, cleared his throat mid-segment and said, look, maybe she had a point. If the paperwork doesn't line up, we can't just ignore it. For his listeners, it was as if the air in the studio had changed. A single sentence, but loaded with reluctant respect. The ripples traveled fast. On YouTube, a retired immigration officer, white-haired, stiff posture, his old badge framed behind him, uploaded a short, unscripted video. His voice was gravelly, worn by years of bureaucratic grind. I processed over 8,000 cases in my career, he said plainly. If any of those files look like Melania's record, denied instantly, no debate. The clip spread like wildfire, crossing political lines. Veterans groups shared it. Teachers played it in civics classes. Even some of the officers' former colleagues added quiet nods in the comment threads. The emotional resonance deepened. For once, it wasn't Jasmine alone standing in the storm. It was others stepping forward, voices from unexpected corners, affirming what she had dared to say aloud. The respect didn't come in grand declarations. It came in small gestures. The radio hosts cutting off callers who tried to mock her, the late-night comedians dropping her name from punchlines, the online forums where users admitted, I never thought I'd agree with her, but... And perhaps that was the real twist. Her enemies weren't mocking anymore. They were hedging. Instead of open ridicule, they spoke in half sentences, hedged bets, carefully chosen qualifiers. We don't know all the details. It's complicated. Maybe this isn't the hill to die on. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, like watching a tide pull back, the mocking roar replaced by an uneasy quiet. Behind the scenes, Jasmine noticed the difference too. The hate mail still came, but threaded between it were letters of gratitude. A young lawyer in Chicago wrote, "You gave me the courage to ask questions at work. I don't care if they roll their eyes anymore." A grandmother from Tennessee added, "They laughed at you the way they laughed at us. Keep standing." Each note, handwritten or typed, was proof that respect was sprouting in unlikely soil. The national conversation had entered new terrain. This was no longer a question dismissed as petty or partisan. It was becoming something larger, something harder to contain. Every time someone in power hedged instead of laughed, Jasmine's voice carried further. Every time a skeptic softened, her calm defiance looked less like provocation and more like foresight. By the end of the week, one thing was clear. The story wasn't just surviving, it was gaining a strange new momentum. Even the loudest critics, once eager to bury her under mockery, now seemed to sense the danger of underestimating her again. The whispers of change had begun, and once whispers start spreading, they rarely stop. The press conference wasn't flashy. No red carpet, no booming music, no wall of flags staged for drama. Instead, behind Jasmine stood a simple banner. White letters bold against deep blue. Same rules, same country. The room was packed. Cameras pressed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters buzzing like bees around a hive. Everyone expected fireworks. But when Jasmine stepped to the podium, she carried only a thin stack of notes in the calm presence that had become her signature. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't point fingers. She began with a pause, looking slowly across the room, as if measuring every face. Then, steady and measured, she spoke. If one group follows the rules, everyone should. That is not controversy. That is consistency. The words landed like steady drum beats. No flourish, no sharp edges, just clarity. Some reporters scribbled furiously, others stopped writing altogether, realizing the line itself might become tomorrow's headline. In a political climate addicted to shouting, her restraint cut deeper than outrage could. For nearly 10 minutes, she held the room. She didn't bring up Melania's name. She didn't repeat the allegations. Instead, she turned the focus outward, toward the families filling out forms in waiting rooms, the immigrants waiting months for a hearing, the veterans standing in line for documents that questioned their loyalty. This is bigger than one person, she said. This is about whether the rules mean the same thing for all of us. Because if they don't, then the rules aren't rules. They're privileges. Emotional undercurrents rippled through the crowd. One reporter lowered her pen, realizing she was blinking back tears. A cameraman shifted, suddenly aware of the silence that had taken over the room. Jasmine wasn't performing for sound bites. She was steadying the conversation, redirecting it from personalities to principles. And that became the twist. The country wasn't just reacting to her anymore. They were re-examining fairness itself. Commentators on both sides replayed her words with surprising seriousness. Civics teachers wove them into lessons. Clergy quoted them in sermons. At dinner tables, parents repeated them to their children. If one group follows the rules, everyone should. Jasmine didn't claim victory. There was no triumphant smile, no gloating. Instead, when the final question was asked, "Do you feel vindicated?" she answered with the same calm resolve that had defined her from the start. This was never about me. It's about us, and us deserves the truth. Then she stepped away, leaving the microphones buzzing in her absence. Outside, and the banner still hung. Same rules, same country, but it no longer looked like a slogan. It looked like a mirror, reflecting back a question every American now had to face for themselves. The studio lights hummed overhead, warm but unrelenting. The set was simple, a sleek desk, 2 chairs angled toward one another, and a backdrop of the Capitol dome glowing in twilight. For Jasmine, it was her first long sit-down primetime interview. The nation was watching, not just for her words, but for her measure, for the person behind the headlines. The anchor leaned in, voice calm but intent. "Congresswoman Crockett, when you raised that question months ago, did you anticipate it would ripple like this?" Jasmine inhaled, steady and deliberate. She shook her head slightly, her expression both serious and soft. "I didn't say it for ambition. I said it because silence was heavier than the risk." The words hung in the air. The anchor nodded slowly, not rushing to fill the silence, allowing viewers at home to sit with the weight of her confession. For once, the spectacle of politics was stripped away, replaced by something far more human. A daughter raised in a family that taught her to speak when it mattered. A representative who carried other people's fears into the chamber with her. She leaned forward, hands clasped gently. There are times when not speaking feels like complicity, and I couldn't live with that. If someone asked me years from now what I did in that room, I wanted to say, I told the truth. Emotional undercurrents rippled beyond the screen. In living rooms across America, people found themselves nodding, not at a partisan line, but at a universal truth. The teacher grading papers on her couch, the veteran in his recliner, the grandmother watching with her granddaughter. They saw a woman whose courage wasn't reckless, but rooted in something deeper, integrity. The anchor pressed further, but without confrontation. And do you regret how loud the aftermath became? The scrutiny? The threats? Jasmine tilted her head, acknowledging the weight of the question. Threats will always come when you challenge power. But calm isn't weakness. Calm is my weapon. When others shout, I can still be heard. It was not the thunder of defiance, but the quiet edge of conviction. The twist became clear in that moment. Her calm, her refusal to mirror anger with anger, had become the most powerful weapon of all. The camera panned slightly, catching the anchor's subtle nod, a gesture that spoke volumes. Respect, not for political maneuvering, but for humanity. For the audience, the takeaway wasn't outrage or scandal, but something much rarer, recognition. They weren't watching a politician deliver talking points. They were watching a woman explain why silence was never an option. By the time the segment ended, the hashtags and sound bites were already forming. But the true legacy wasn't digital. It was emotional. The calm tone, the steady eyes, the quiet insistence that fairness mattered had carved itself into the national conversation. And for the first time, the fight didn't feel like hers alone. It felt like a question the whole country was now asking, aloud, together. The air in the Baltimore high school gym was thick with the scent of floor polish and teenage anticipation. Folding chairs squeaked as students shifted nervously, unsure what to expect. Banners from past basketball championships lined the walls. But today the court wasn't about games. It was about questions. Jasmine stepped to the podium. No teleprompter, no grand stagecraft, just her voice, a microphone, and the eyes of young people who had grown up in a world that taught them to measure their words carefully. She paused before speaking, letting the hum of whispers quiet. Asking questions, she began, her voice steady but warm, isn't un-American. It's the most American thing you can do. A ripple moved through the gym. Some students nodded immediately. Others tilted their heads, weighing the idea. For years, many had been told to sit still, stay quiet, not make trouble. Yet here was a congresswoman standing in front of them, saying the opposite, that questions were not disruptions, but the heartbeat of democracy. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It wasn't the kind of orchestrated cheer that filled rallies. It was better, genuine, uneven, and real. Some clapped shyly, some whistled, others tapped the backs of their chairs. The sound grew, not because anyone told them to, but because they wanted to. Jasmine smiled, scanning the faces in front of her. She told them about her own classroom days, how she'd been that kid in the back who felt the weight of silence pressing on her chest. I learned that silence can protect you, she admitted, but it can also chain you, and you deserve more than chains. The gym grew quieter, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but charged, waiting. When the session ended, students began filing out in clumps, buzzing with chatter. Some lined up to shake her hand, others simply glanced back as if committing her presence to memory. Then, as she stepped down from the podium, a boy about 14, backpack slung loosely over one shoulder, shuffled forward. He didn't make eye contact right away, His hand trembled slightly as he held out a crumpled piece of notebook paper. She unfolded it. The handwriting was uneven, smudged in places, as if written quickly between classes. "I thought I had to stay quiet. Thanks for showing me I don't." Jasmine looked up, but the boy had already slipped back into the crowd, swallowed by the sea of students streaming toward the doors. She held the note gently, as though it were something fragile but alive. The emotional beat was undeniable. For all the debates on television, for all the headlines that came and went like storms, this note from a teenager was the proof of legacy. Not the legacy of a law passed or a speech recorded in the congressional record, but the quiet beginning of courage in someone who thought they had none. The twist crystallized in that moment. Her story's power didn't begin in Congress at all. It began here, in a high school gym, scribbled in pencil on a crumpled scrap of paper. And from that single act of courage, the future was already rewriting itself. The phrase started as a backdrop on a press conference stage. Same rules, same country. By the time summer rolled in, it was everywhere. The hashtag same standards swept across social media. No longer a passing trend, but a rallying cry. It wasn't about partisanship anymore. It was about fairness, a value older than the republic itself. In neighborhoods from Detroit to Dallas, young artists painted murals across brick walls, portraits of ordinary families standing tall beneath those words. Bumper stickers appeared on rusted pickup trucks and polished sedans alike. Sunday sermons echoed the line, pastors weaving it into homilies about truth, justice, and dignity. The phrase had leapt from politics into culture, living on the lips of people who had never once quoted a congresswoman before. Jasmine watched it happen quietly. She didn't hold parades or victory rallies. She didn't gloat, didn't replay the viral clip in endless loops. Instead, she slipped back into her routines, drafting legislation, listening to constituents, mentoring interns who were still learning how heavy silence could be. She moved with a steadiness that signaled the fight was never about her ego. It was about the ground she stood on, and making sure it could hold everyone. The emotional beat came not in headlines, but in the small, ordinary moments. A woman at the grocery store touched her arm and whispered, "My son asked me what the rules were for us, and for them. I told him, now we can ask out loud." An older man, a retired factory worker, sent her a handwritten letter thanking her for saying what had been stuck in his throat for years. "We wanted to ask," he wrote, "but didn't know if we had the right." And still, Jasmine did not lift herself above the people repeating her words. She seemed to know instinctively that the echo mattered more than the source. Her calm refusal to treat this as her personal triumph only made the resonance stronger. By fall, the campaign had grown into something larger than anyone predicted. Advocacy groups sprouted under the banner of the same standard, holding workshops in community centers, schools, and churches. The question was no longer whether Jasmine had overstepped. It was whether America had been avoiding a truth too obvious to ignore. The final twist revealed itself with quiet inevitability. The real legacy of that moment was never about Trump, never about Melania, not even about the headlines that rose and fell like waves. It was about Americans daring to ask their own questions in classrooms, barbershops, veterans' halls, and kitchen tables. Her voice had cracked open the silence, but it was the voices of the people, ordinary, unpolished, unafraid, that filled the space after. And in that echo, a nation discovered something startlingly simple. The power to question was not a privilege. It was the very foundation of belonging.